Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss about the Chakma minority in Bangladesh. In this lecture, we will try and address some of the pertinent questions related to Chakma community, such as who are Chakmas, history of their tragedy, their plight as unwanted migrants in India, their persecution and quest for justice. Let me begin this lecture by providing you the basic understanding of Chakma minority community in Bangladesh. Chakma, also called Changma, Sakma or Sangma, is the indigenous tribal community of Bangladesh, which is also settled in parts of northeastern India and many parts in Myanmar. They were the largest of the 13 tribes in that district. The other ethnic groups of the district are Marma, Teparas, Chak, Murang, Khumi and Pakho. Among these tribes, the Chakma formed the largest and dominant ethnic group and have their own history, folklore, script, language, culture and profess Theravada Buddhism and belong originally to Mongoloid stock. They have their own counterparts in adjoining areas in India and Myanmar. They speak a mixed language of Bengali, Pali and Sanskrit, but when it comes to their writing, they use the Burmese script. The Chakmas generally lived in highland valleys. They are divided into 46 clans, also known as Gozas. The Chakma tribes many times be pronounced as Sakma or Sak. The tribe is known as Thek by Burmese and Thuthak by Kuki. The Chakma or Chukma, as spelled by some British ethnographers, is a generic term given to the predominant hill tribes of the Chittagong hill tracts. The Chakmas are classified into two major groups on the basis of the places they live. They are the Khangthas, who live on the bank of the river, while Thangthas, also called as Jumias, live on hilltop. Besides, the Doingnaks also belong to the Chakma tribe, but is said to be the smaller section of the tribe and later fled to Arakan in Myanmar. The earliest history of Chakma ethnic group is not known. One of the most widely known theories which majority of the Chakmas hold is that they came originally from a country named Champaran in the Champaran area, Bihar, to the Arakan hills and finally settled down in the Chittagong district. It is said the king of the Champaran had two sons, namely Bijoygiri and Samargiri. When Bijoygiri was away on a campaign to conquest in the east, his younger brother usurped the throne and prepared to resist by force the return of his elder brother. In hearing this news, Bijoygiri decided not to return and settled down in the hilly regions which he had then conquered. Eventually, his followers intermarried with the women of this country who were Buddhist by religion. Thus, the children of these intermarriages are believed to be the Chakmas. As such, the Chakmas are said to be descendants of Bijoygiri and his followers. Besides the above mentioned theory with regard to the origin of Chakmas, there are others who believed that the Chakmas are Arakanese immigrants, as would be evident by their dialect, which is an admixture of Tibeto-Burman group of languages. The Chakma language does not resemble any of the tribal languages of northeast India. Their vernacular language is a dialect of Arakan country, which has over the years been influenced to a great deal by Bengali. The Chakmas, like other Mongoloid racial groups left their original habitat place and came towards their present homeland sometimes in the past. Let me come to the history of Chakma's tragedy. The tragedy of Chakma as stateless people is among the worst legacies of 1947 partition of the Indian subcontinent. Rarely has there been an instance of social and political exclusion in the history of modern South Asia when a group of people has been so consistently denied the opportunity to exercise one of their basic and universally recognized fundamental human rights, and that is the right to self-determination. When Chakmas expressed their desire to become Indian citizens in 1947, they instead found themselves as Pakistani nationals in the complete defiance of the very logic of partition of the Indian subcontinent. Furthermore, while the emergence of Bangladesh as an independent sovereign state in 1971 did renew their hopes of fulfilling their political aspirations, they soon discovered that there was no autonomous political cultural space for them in what was an overwhelmingly Muslim dominant society. Mujibur Rahman's rejection of Chakma's autonomy plea on the basis of their ethnicity was, if anything, an early indication of aggressive Bengali nationalism that they were to witness in its myriad forms in future. What followed was a protracted struggle for the right to self-determination, albeit in its limited sense of autonomy within the state, by the ethnic minorities under the banner of Shanti Bahini. The Bangladeshi state, much like centralized Pakistani state before it, resorted to the all too common approach of suppression and oppression of the dissent in its pursuit to homogenize and assimilate the ethnic minorities within the larger Bengalized nationalist frame. It may be significant to note in this context that while the Bangladeshi state went overboard in coercing its national ethnic minorities in Chittagong hill tracts into submission, it has never actually owned the Chakmas who took refuge in India in 1964 on the ground that Bangladesh could not be held responsible for the doings of its predecessor, that is East Pakistan, as it came into existence only at a much later stage after the Chakmas' actual exodus to India. This has put the Chakmas in a peculiar situation, as the very source of their citizenship, that is East Pakistan, has long ceased to exist, and the new inheritor state of Bangladesh has in effect de-recognized them by not even acknowledging them as its own people in its constitution. Much to their woes, the Indian state's reassurance to the duly grant them citizenship over the last several decades has meant little to them, while they continue to remain outside the purview of protection of any national state. What is even more puzzling is the fact that they were resettled in a region of India which happens to enjoy an unique status under the Indian federal arrangement, where even Indian citizens cannot move about freely owing to specific restrictions on outsiders right since the colonial period. Arunachal Pradesh, which was then known as Northeastern Frontier Agency and was centrally administered, continued to be in the throes of a raging controversy because of some of the specific laws governing the state, which debars even bona fide Indian citizens to move into the state without fulfilling certain formalities like obtaining prior permission. For example, the inner line permit of the state government under the Bengal Eastern Frontier Regulation Act of 1873. The genesis of the problem in its present form goes back to 1964, when the completion of Kaptai hydroelectric dam over the Karnafui River in Chittagong Hill Tracts, sponsored by the United States Agency for International Development, inundated 40% of the prime cultivable land of the indigenous inhabitants, displacing and turning approximately 1 lakh people, almost 1/6 of the population, into developmental or environmental refugees. Constituting about 90% of the total affected people, the Chakmas were the largest indigenous ethnic group to be displaced, who subsequently came to be known as Kaptai Ostis or developmental refugees. Even though the extent and magnitude of displacement caused by this development endeavor clearly makes it one of the earliest examples of mass displacement in South Asia, precious little is known about the very dimensions of the problem. Not consulted about the dam, they were also not compensated either financially or with the other land, thus leaving them with no option but to cross over to India, for there was no other obvious land to offer to these sedentary rice growing farmers. Only a vastly oversubscribed residual forest area where zooming, that is shifting cultivation, was proving unsustainable. What is more, the issue of Kaptai Ostis has also not been able to attract the kind of attention, both popular and scholarly, which is generally accorded to such people today. The issue of Kaptai Ostis does not even find a mention in the current debate on the development displacement. Moreover, other issues relating to the flight and consequent plight of Chakmas have also remained largely unattended. For example, the existing literature on the plight of Chakmas overemphasizes the fact of environmental or developmental factors to such an extent that all other factors are either underplayed or discounted as redundant or not worth taking into account. The resultant understanding of the causes of the flight of Chakmas is thus not only skewed but also suffers from certain amount of ambiguity and obscurity, as no serious attempt has been made to highlight the political dimension of their involuntary displacement, which were no less than responsible than the environmental or developmental aspects in forcing them to seek refuge in India. Coming from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of what was then East Pakistan, some 40,000 Chakmas had taken asylum and were settled by India in the erstwhile Northeastern Frontier Agency during 1964-69. Since then, a lot has changed. East Pakistan became sovereign state of Bangladesh in 1971. The Northeastern Frontier Agency was first accorded the status Union Territory in 1972 and was renamed as Arunachal Pradesh. In 1987, it was accorded the status of a full provincial state within the Indian Union. Meanwhile, the Chakma population has grown to an estimated 65,000. They have remained stateless for more than 4 decades of their stay in India. The Indian state has chosen not to fulfill its constitutional commitment, despite a recent Supreme Court verdict in favor of granting them citizenship status. Having lived in their new place of settlement for more than 4 decades, with a sizable number born and brought up here, Chakmas have no desire to be repatriated, and hence they demand Indian citizenship and all rights. The response of the indigenous peoples, on the other hand, has been one of the alarm and protest at such a prospect. Arunachalis fear that they stand to lose land as well as employment. that political power will shift out of their hands and they might even be reduced to a minority in their own land, living under the hegemony of those whom they clearly see as foreigners. The Chakmas, as it is argued, have now become unwanted migrants in Arunachal Pradesh as they took refuge in India because they were treated as rejected people back home. Now coming to the plight of Chakmas diaspora in northeast India. The plight of Chakma diaspora scattered across some of the northeastern provinces of the Indian state may not be unparalleled in the history of migration in the world, but is undoubtedly by far one of the most prolonged episodes of social and political exclusion in the history of modern South Asia. Although the social history of Chakma diaspora provides significant insight in the post-colonial fault lines emanating from the artificial division of the Indian subcontinent, the extent of their exclusion and fragmentation is only partly attributable to the partition of the subcontinent, as a substantial number of them had moved into India much before 1947. The largest concentration of Chakmas outside the Chittagong hill tracts. Their homeland in Bangladesh is to be found in northeastern states of Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram and Tripura. Fragmented and scattered across northeastern region, the Chakmas have not only come to be called Palestinians of South Asia, but they also enjoy distinct status in their respective areas of settlement. However, unlike the Palestinians, they no longer clamor for their homeland and are determined to stay put in the places they have made homes. Not that all is well with them in the what has now come to constitute a new home. On the contrary, things have only worsened with growing resentment amongst the local ethnic groups among whom they have been living all these years irrespective of their legal status. In their homeland of Chittagong hill tracts as well as in their northeast India exile, the Chakmas are about as vulnerable as it is possible for any community to be. A tenuous peace prevails in the hill tracts themselves and in the points of their diaspora in India, Tripura, Mizoram and Arunachal. They face hostile locals and a rising threat of eviction. The Chakma refugees, it need to be mentioned here, left in Assam, Tripura and Mizoram were granted citizenship rights and recognized as scheduled tribe. In Arunachal, citizenship for the Chakmas became tied to the question of land rights. Arunachal enjoys special constitutional protections that ensure that non-indigenous Indians cannot buy land in the state, let alone refugees from other countries. In a sparsely populated region, moreover, it was feared that the granting citizenship rights to the Chakmas would change the demography and influence voting outcomes to the detriment of the indigenous population. The Students' Union mobilized popular support for its demand as it accused the Indian state of using the region as a dumping ground for the migrants and refugees. Inevitably, the question of citizenship for the Chakmas became a political tussle between the Arunachal and the central government. In 1995, for instance, the Congress government led by Gigong Apang threatened to resign unless the center relocated the refugees from the state. The center, however, was content to maintain status quo. The Chakmas' fate has been absorbed into a new strand of politics that gained ground after the Bharatiya Janata Party came to power in 2014. The project to ease citizenship for religious minorities who have sought refuge in India. In 2015, the Supreme Court directed the center to grant the Chakmas and Hindu Hejong refugee citizenship in Arunachal, fueling fresh anger in the state. In 2017, the center announced it was all set to grant them citizenship status. The Chakmas are now caught between competing versions of identity politics, one emanating from the center and the other from the region. Apart from the Arunachal, there is fresh animosity from the indigenous tribes towards the refugees in Mizoram, which created a Chakma Autonomous District Council in 1972. Tribal groups now agitate for the expulsion of all Chakma foreigners who entered the state after 1950. Meanwhile, thousands of Chakmas in Arunachal still live in miserable conditions without land rights, ration cards, access to schools after the primary level or jobs. The imperious policies of the center and the identity politics of the state have extracted a terrible human cost. The persecution of Chakmas and their quest for justice. That's what I am going to discuss now. The indigenous peoples of the Chittagong hill tracts of Bangladesh, of which the Chakmas are the largest community, have been subject to violence by the Bangladesh security forces for decades. Since Bangladesh's independence in 1971, the violence against the indigenous peoples of Chittagong hill tracts has been perpetuated through ethno-religious demographic engineering that has used state-sponsored mass transmigration to achieve the muscular nationalist aspiration of state security and power. The civil, judicial and political institutions intended to protect the community have at the same time been locally debased, allowing the military to act with impunity in the Chittagong hill tracts. The situation for the indigenous peoples of Chittagong hill tracts remains grim. With little recourse to justice within the nation state of Bangladesh and its institutions because of the power of the military and the muscular nationalist subversions of civil, judicial and political institutions, the indigenous peoples of Chittagong hill tracts have attempted to construct alternative networks of mutual support. Thus, over the decades, they have developed cooperative relationships with national and international organizations that are neither beholden to the state nor hampered by the inertia of the older international relations structures. Such structures have actually enhanced the power of the Bangladesh military and thus aggravated the conditions in the Chittagong hill tracts. The national and international organizations in these alternative networks include indigenous groups, minority rights groups, human rights groups, labor rights groups, and women's groups. In the 1980s, CST activist groups such as the Hill Women's Federation and the Hill Students' Council brought many human rights violations in the Chittagong hill tracts to international attention through their linkages with the transnational human rights and indigenous rights advocacy organizations. These organizations include the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, the International Labour Organization, Amnesty International, Anti-Slavery Society, the Survival International, Parliamentary Human Rights Groups in Europe, the Minority Rights Groups, and the Organizing Committee Chittagong Hill Tracts Campaign. In 1989, the Chittagong Hill Tracts Commission was established as an outcome of an international indigenous peoples conference in Amsterdam. The commission, sponsored by IWGIA and consisting of high-profile international commissioners, published its first report in 1991, bringing international exposure to human rights violations in CST through authoritative comprehensive documentation. The CHTC published updates in 92, 94 and in 1997 before the signing of the 1997 CHT Accord. The international publication of authoritative credible reports of human rights violation in the CHT contributed to the European Union Parliament offering to provide Bengali trans migrants with funds for relocating away from CHT, an offer that Bangladesh ignored. Delays in implementing the provisions of the accord and the news of protracted violence in CHT led to the reconstitution of the CHTC in 2008. The CHT activists understood the strong desire of Bangladesh military personnel to take up the lucrative positions in UN peacekeeping missions. They thus recognized the possibility of reducing human rights violations in the CHT by lobbying the UN to ensure that military personnel who committed human rights violations in their home country would not be allowed to serve as the UN peacekeepers. Work on the issue by CHT and other international activists culminated in the 2012 approval of a UN policy requiring the human rights screening of UN personnel. Even though indigenous CHT activists, particularly women, have refused to victimhood and made gains through their participation in global human rights and indigenous and women's networks, the prognosis for indigenous peoples in the CHT remains dire. Widespread discrimination, abuse, and sexual assault continues unabated, and the failure to fully implement the CHT Accord means that the indigenous communities are unable to effectively participate in the decisions affecting their lands. To conclude, dear students, in today's lecture we discussed one of the tragic legacies of partition of the South Asian subcontinent, the issue of Chakma minority. We attempted to provide a broad overview of the Chakma community, their origin, and the history of the checkered past where the community became victim of politics of development. The Chakmas were displaced to become unwanted migrants in India's northeast, especially Arunachal Pradesh. We then also discussed their plight as refugees in the northeast India, and we finally ended by discussing their persecution by Bangladesh state and their quest for justice. Dear students, I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.